How's that? Any better? Yeah? Is that working? I can't see you up there. Yeah. Is it working? Yes? Yes? Okay. Technical genius. If it was MIT, they'd never get it to work. Well, I was saying that I'll start with a couple of general comments on the topic, and then we can throw it open to discussion. It's quite usual these days to draw analogies between South Africa and Israel. Most of them, I think, are questionable at best. But there's one that isn't discussed much, if at all, that is actually quite valid, I think, one analogy. That has to do with the topic, with the matter of what's nowadays called legitimation and delegitimation. That was an issue for South Africa for about the last 40 years of the white nationalist regime. Back in 1958, the South African foreign minister called in the U.S. ambassador to talk to him and said, we know that we're becoming a kind of an international pariah. Everyone's voting against us in the United Nations. We're right that they don't understand it. But it doesn't really matter, because you and I both understand that there's only one vote at the United Nations, namely yours. And as long as you in the United States back us up, we don't really care what the world thinks. And so matters, in fact, proceeded through the, by the 1970s, the United Nations did declare an arms embargo on South Africa. South Africa, by that point, reacted by becoming extremely aggressive and contemptuous towards the international community, and in fact, even the United States. President Carter at that time. So, for example, when President Carter and a group of international diplomats were about to present a plan for a South African withdrawal from Namibia, a UN protectorate which they were occupying, sending in a population and so on, in violation of UN orders. Just at that point, South Africa attacked a refugee camp in Angola, a refugee camp, killing 800 people, causing international outcry, but they basically didn't care. Well, fortunately for them, Ronald Reagan came along, and he strongly supported the apartheid regime and continued to support it right through the 1980s. That included its aggression and violence in neighboring countries, which was quite lethal, killing over 1 million people, plus what was going on within South Africa. But the U.S. supported it. In fact, U.S. trade with South Africa increased. That was in violation even of congressional sanctions by that time. And the justification for it was the war on terror. Now, the war on terror was not declared by George W. Bush, contrary to what's claimed. He redeclared it. It was declared by Ronald Reagan when he came into office in 1981, announcing that international terrorism, plague of the modern age, would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy. So in the case of South Africa, the justification was to defend the white nationalist regime against the terrorism of the African National Congress. In fact, in 1988, the U.S. designated, this is Mandela's ANC, he was of course in prison, the U.S. designated the ANC as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. In fact, Mandela was just taken off the terrorist list about 2 years ago. He can now come to the United States without a special dispensation. Then the U.S. policy changed. Around 1989, 1990, the U.S. policy shifted, and within 2 or 3 years, the white nationalist regime had collapsed, and apartheid was over. This is not the only time that's happened. Incidentally, that was not the only factor. Another major factor was Cuba. Cuba, which has played an enormous role in the liberation of Black Africa. It's sort of well known by now to scholarship, but not to the general public. They essentially drove South Africans out of Namibia, and as they had driven them out of Angola, and that was a big factor. But the main change was just that the U.S. policy shifted, and exactly as the South African foreign minister had said 40 years earlier, when the U.S. changed policy, the regime collapsed. As I say, there are other cases. Well, the problem for South Africa was its delegitimation in the international community, sustained by U.S. support, so it didn't matter until U.S. support was withdrawn, and the legitimation of its main enemy, the African National Congress, which by the late 80s had enormous international support. Mandela's kind of a secular saint by now. Those of you who follow Israeli affairs know that that's pretty much what they're discussing now with great concern. There's concern that the country is being delegitimated in the international arena. And at the same time, it's the Palestinians are being legitimated. That's a situation, and they have one supporter, the United States, alone. In fact, that has gone on for a long time. You probably know that a couple of months ago, in February, there was a Security Council resolution calling on Israel to pursue what in fact is official U.S. policy, namely to stop settlement expansion. It was vetoed by the United States alone. That aroused some attention, but it really shouldn't have, because the U.S. had been vetoing resolutions condemning Israel's actions for a long time. The first one was in January 1976, 35 years ago, when the major Arab states brought to the Security Council a resolution calling for a two-state settlement, Israel and a Palestinian state, on the international border, so-called Green Line, then it took up the wording of UN 242, which everyone recognizes to be the main diplomatic instrument. So there would have to be added guarantees for the security of every state in the region and its right to exist within secure and recognized borders. That's 1976. The U.S. vetoed it again in 1980. I won't run through the rest of the record, but until the present, that's been the pattern. Things moved out of the Security Council because excluded by the U.S. veto, but the General Assembly almost every year had regular votes, 150 to 2 or something like that, and that continues up to the present. Well, this is continuing. There'll be another important vote, very likely, in the coming session of the General Assembly starting next September, as a winter meeting. What's coming up then is recognition of Palestinian statehood. By now, well over 100 countries have recognized Palestine. It's about something like 80 to 90% of the world's population. In contrast, Kosovo, which is now accepted as in the United Nations that. But the crucial difference is the U.S. does not join the 80 to 90% recognizing Palestine, and the U.S. does recognize Kosovo. So that's basically the South African minister's insight into how world affairs works, and it's direct. But anyway, this is going to come up, it's very likely going to come up in September, and it'll pose another dilemma for the United States. Will it stand virtually alone in the international system in blocking the kind of settlement for which there is simply an overwhelming international consensus? Hard to find anything like this in world affairs. But for years, there's been an overwhelming agreement on approximately the January 1976 Security Council proposal that the U.S. vetoed. And by now it includes essentially everybody, at least formally, all the non-aligned countries, Europe, Latin America, the Arab League, which has an even more forthcoming proposal, the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran, in fact, essentially everyone. The only holdouts are the United States and Israel, and the South African minister's principle still applies. There's only one vote, and that's the United States. The consequence of having overwhelming power. So the world can say what it wants, but if the United States objects, nobody can do anything about it. Well, that's the, and that of course shapes commentary and discussion and so on, at least in the United States, to some extent, elsewhere, lesser extent. Well, that's basically the situation, and it's as far as Israel's delegitimation is concerned, they're getting much more concerned. So, for example, Human Rights Watch, which is a very conservative organization, they don't take strong positions on policy. They recently came out with a declaration, which I don't think was even recorded here, at least I didn't see it, which called on the United States to terminate aid to Israel, any aid to Israel, up to the level of what Israel spends in the occupied territories. Because, as they point out correctly, all of that is in violation of international law. They also call on the United States government to investigate foundations, organizations, others in the United States, which have a tax-free status and are